The interspecies classroom buzzed with ambient chatter, a subtle hum of translated words bouncing off the smooth alloy walls. Dozens of alien students, each an evolutionary product of worlds utterly foreign to each other, gathered into small clusters beneath the soft light of the orbital station's education wing. Gravity was tuned to a neutral compromise, not perfect for anyone, yet tolerable for all. The atmosphere was chemically balanced, just humid enough for the aquatic forms, dry enough for the crystalline species, and breathable for the lone human in the room. Kalen stood at the front of the class, motionless but aware. He wasn't tall by human standards, but even his stillness carried an unfamiliar weight to the others. Alien eyes, some clustered like compound lenses, others rotating independently, followed him as one might follow an uncertain element. They had been taught that humans hailed from a Category 5 death world, a designation that wasn't given lightly. Earth was a place where predation, climate volatility, microbial warfare, and constant environmental threats shaped its apex life form into something the rest of the galaxy could hardly categorize. The students knew the facts. They had read the files. Yet standing in a room with a Deathworlder was different. Kalen didn't act the part. He didn't snarl, didn't impose. He taught calmly, speaking with deliberate pacing, eyes flicking across the room in a way that set some on edge. Not aggressive, just aware. Constantly aware. His voice, translated seamlessly into dozens of dialects, was neutral but carried an underlying certainty. There was something in how he explained predator-prey balance, territorial behavior, or ecological collapse. Something that implied lived experience, not just academic knowledge. Students from softer planets had difficulty parsing the paradox. How could something so adaptable also be so calm? How could an apex predator choose to teach rather than dominate? The crystalline Thazak had calculated, statistically, that most human reactions during crisis scenarios fell outside of predicted norms. They were unpredictable not because they were irrational, but because their entire psychology evolved to expect chaos. It wasn't madness. It was adaptation, deep, cellular, and unnerving. Today's lecture was on interspecies biosphere design. Simulated containment environments for controlled observation of planetary fauna. Standard curriculum. Each student group had contributed a creature, non-sentient, non-telepathic, low-threat species only. In theory. The sealed transport capsule currently humming in the center of the room was said to contain a mid-level predator from a jungle moon orbiting Gliese 122. Cleared for observation. Slated for educational purposes. Harmless, with appropriate containment. Still, the atmosphere in the room had shifted when the capsule arrived. Kalen approached it with the same measured cadence he always carried. No hesitation, no weapon, just a remote interface clipped to his hip. He scanned the container, noting internal temperature fluctuations, a rise in CO2 levels, minor vibrations. He tapped a few controls, not activating release, just diagnostics. He noticed what others missed, the claw marks beginning to appear inside the reinforced window. Behind him, a few students had backed away from their seats. The aquatic annelidans began secreting a transparent gel in response to elevated stress. A quadrupedal student from a low-gravity planet flattened to the floor instinctively. None of them made noise. They were prey species by nature. Fear was processed efficiently and silently. But Kalen's back remained straight. The scratches intensified. A low, guttural exhale leaked from the capsule, not loud but distinctly alive. It was not supposed to make that sound. The transportation seals were rated to withstand up to Class 2 aggression patterns. This creature was now exhibiting borderline Class 3 behavior. Kalen glanced at the class without turning his head. No visible panic yet, but some were beginning to cluster at the edges. He calmly spoke. "Containment is holding," he said, more to steady the room than to inform. "But we're going to keep the diagnostic feed up for observation. Do not approach the central ring." No one moved. Somewhere near the back, a student whispered to another, their translator struggling to convey tone. "Why isn't he afraid?" The capsule gave a sudden clank, not from mechanical failure, but from something inside launching its weight against the inner wall. One crystalline student froze mid-blink, their internal structure locking up in a full biological shutdown reflex. Kalen merely stepped closer. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw a tool. He simply watched the creature's shadow as it shifted, calculating something behind his calm expression. The class saw a man surrounded by alien life. The humans saw vectors, pressure seals, emergency override placements, and a creature struggling in an unfamiliar space. And he stood still, not out of ignorance, but because he was the only one in the room who had ever been the prey and the predator, sometimes within the same day. A second clank. Louder. The lights flickered once. Something inside the capsule hissed again. Wet, low, wrong. And Kalen smiled. The sound came without warning, metal on metal, not the steady hiss of pressure regulation but the abrupt screech of containment stress. The capsule holding the Glee's predator shuddered once, and then the integrity alarm chirped a flat, inconclusive tone that drew every set of eyes forward. The translator overlays froze mid-sentence as the system diverted processing power to hazard protocol. Then the front panel of the capsule folded outward like thin foil, torn from the inside. The creature moved too quickly for most to process. A blur of sinew, chitin, and plum-colored muscle, roughly the size of a large dog but lower to the ground. Its gait was crouched, efficient, built for short, brutal bursts. For limbs touched the floor before its hind legs pressed off, launching it into the air with a screech that cut through the classroom's synthetic air like a blade. It landed near the first row. The scream never came. No one had the time. Some students recoiled on instinct, motion-triggered muscle contractions, defensive folds in armor-like skin, sudden pigment changes designed for camouflage. One aquatic species expelled a cloud of bioluminescent liquid, blotting out half the room in floating, fluorescent blobs. Another dropped flat, heart rate halving instantly, mimicking death. Prey instincts overruled intellect. The creature didn't attack immediately. It circled, movements staccato and precise. Its nostrils flared as it searched for vulnerability. Its eyes locked on the smallest student, a light gravity native with undeveloped external defenses. The predator crouched low, analyzing, readying itself. The student didn't move. Couldn't. Muscles locked. Breath held. Heartbeat visible through translucent skin. Kalen stepped forward once. No sudden movement, no raised voice, just a shift in presence. He didn't grab a weapon or activate an alert. His posture changed, a subtle alignment of shoulders and hips, a centering that suggested not confrontation, but readiness. The predator noticed. It turned its head toward him. The room, still paralyzed in fear, was silent enough that the soft inhale from the creature was audible, like damp cloth being wrung dry. The human's expression didn't change. He stood inside the arc of danger, between predator and prey, without hesitation. His breathing was steady. One step further, then another. The creature's claws flexed. Not a bluff. It was deciding. Kalen didn't present aggression. Instead, he did what no prey ever did. He held eye contact. Not dominance. Not challenge. Recognition. The kind that came from one apex predator to another. In human evolution, prey fled. Predators calculated. This wasn't bravado. It was biology, honed by millennia of living on a planet that tried to kill everything it birthed. He raised a single hand slowly, palm forward, a universal signal across dozens of known species: halt. The predator froze for a full second. The pause was enough. Kalen shifted slightly to the left, drawing its gaze away from the student. It twitched, tracking him now. The dynamic changed. He wasn't prey. He was now the uncertain variable. Behind him, a containment rod rolled off a bench. He glanced down without moving his head, keeping the creature in peripheral view. It growled, a wet, low resonance that suggested both threat and curiosity. The human moved slowly, lowered his stance, and reached for the rod without looking away. No quick gestures. Just deliberate control. He picked it up and clicked the activation rune. The end hissed to life, glowing faintly with pulse-stabilized light. The creature's eyes narrowed, but it didn't pounce. Kalen took a step forward. The predator stepped back. Not submissive, strategic. It had expected fear. It found calculation. A dozen muscles along its flanks twitched. Its weight shifted. It was measuring the situation again. Kalen advanced one more step, shifting the rod slightly to the left, forcing the creature's movement toward the open containment ring. It hissed, not in rage, but frustration. This wasn't the fight it understood anymore. The human wasn't acting like prey, and it couldn't predict what would come next. The creature hesitated. Kalen dropped his voice, low and steady. The translator didn't bother converting the tone. It wasn't meant for language. It was the sound of calm command, of practiced certainty. The kind of sound predators heard right before a kill, only this one didn't come. The creature stepped back. And kept going. Kalen adjusted his grip on the containment rod, never shifting his gaze from the predator. The rod wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It wasn't meant for force but for influence, modulating energy pulses just enough to redirect behavior without escalation. He didn't need to strike. He needed the creature to choose retreat. The classroom held its collective breath. Even species that didn't respire in the conventional sense stood inert, aware that any disturbance could tip the balance. The predator paced in a tight semicircle, muscles twitching, testing the air. Its aggression hadn't faded, but something deeper had taken root: uncertainty. It didn't understand this opponent. No feint, no panic, no flinch. Just calm. Humans had no natural armor, no venom, no camouflage. What they had was poise in the face of immediate threat, an evolutionary commitment to surviving chaos. Kalen embodied this, not by intent, but by instinct. Every motion was calculated, conserving energy while maintaining control. There was no panic because panic served no function here. The predator lunged forward half a step, jaws parting. Kalen mirrored with a feint of his own, just enough movement to suggest engagement, not threat. The rod shifted in response, emitting a frequency just above hearing, one that vibrated against the creature's sensory organs. Not pain. Discomfort. Confusion. It stumbled back, more frustrated than harmed. It wasn't submission Kalen sought. He wanted the creature to understand he wasn't food, wasn't weak, wasn't worth the effort. Humans weren't designed to overpower nature. They learned to navigate around it, to adapt faster than it could shift. He didn't posture. He demonstrated. The predator's eyes tracked the rod now, not the man. It began to recalibrate its stance, less coiled now. Its breathing changed tempo, shallower. Its instincts were being overridden not through domination, but by encountering something it couldn't fit into the binary of threat or prey. The human represented a third option, uncategorized. Kalen moved forward, rod angled low, non-invasive. He herded without force, guiding it toward the containment ring. The motion was fluid. Every muscle from shoulder to wrist adjusted in micro-measurements. No erratic flailing, no commands shouted. The silence was deliberate. Language would be wasted here. He reached the control node embedded in his belt. With one press, the ring adjusted settings. Its internal environment mimicked the creature's native conditions more closely now. Temperature drop, humidity spike, olfactory cues synthesized and released. The predator paused again. It sniffed. Recognition flickered in its posture. There. Leverage. Kalen didn't press. He allowed the moment to settle. The creature stepped backward into the ring, slow and unsure, gaze never leaving him. One clawed foot, then the next. Kalen stopped moving, letting the system do the rest. Sensors recognized re-entry. Field walls shimmered. Containment re-engaged with a subdued hum. Only then did Kalen exhale. Across the room, the paralyzed student finally blinked. The aquatic's gelatinous secretion began to dissolve into the floor's neutralizing mesh. The crystalline being's rigid stance softened fractionally. One by one, awareness returned to the room. Kalen stood upright, unflinching. He powered down the rod and clipped it to his hip. No celebration, no relief displayed. His demeanor hadn't shifted from the moment the breach began. What the class had witnessed wasn't a performance, it was the baseline. This was what it meant to be human, not at war, but prepared. The predator sat within the ring, no longer snarling. Not tamed, acknowledging a boundary. Not fear. Mutual understanding. To the aliens watching, the display had rewritten the framework through which they understood threat. They had learned protocols, analyzed flowcharts, studied behavior. But what they saw now didn't fit any of it. The human hadn't relied on brute force or high-tech tools. He hadn't panicked, hadn't frozen. He had assessed, adapted, and acted. The moment was quiet, but not empty. Every student present had just seen a lesson they would never forget. Not about predators. About humans. The silence after containment wasn't peace. It was recalibration. Minds raced behind still expressions. None of the alien students spoke immediately. What they'd witnessed contradicted entire volumes of cultural doctrine. Some of them, bred in civilizations where violence had been eradicated, simply lacked the framework to process what had happened. Others, who came from predator-descended lineages themselves, found their own instincts challenged. Kalen hadn't just neutralized the threat, he had done it without escalation. That fact disturbed them more than the predator's escape. The Glee's creature had retreated. Not from injury. Not from pain. From something far less tangible, presence. Not dominance through force, but influence through certainty. The idea that another being could project control without assertion was unfamiliar. It broke paradigms. No one had taught them how to categorize a human who didn't need to overpower because he had already outmaneuvered. Kalen turned back to the class. His expression unchanged. No visible pride, no relief, no expectation. Just clarity. He wasn't here to impress. He was here to teach. And now, they were ready to listen in a way they hadn't been before. Predators don't always fight to win, he said, his voice even. Sometimes they choose not to lose. That's survival. That's control. No one interrupted. Even species without auditory focus stood locked on him, their attention centralized in full. It wasn't just the words. It was the weight of lived truth behind them. He continued pacing slowly. On Earth, threat response isn't just reaction. It's planning under pressure. Understanding intent before motion. We don't rely on physical superiority. We rely on processing speed, pattern recognition, emotional control. We evolved where certainty could get you killed. So we adapted in another direction, calculated unpredictability. Students absorbed the words in absolute stillness. For many, this lecture marked the first time they grasped the depth of what it meant to come from a death world. It wasn't merely about surviving harsher climates or resisting more diseases. It was the psychological architecture of a species trained by necessity to remain composed while surrounded by volatility. A chitin-armored student raised a claw slowly. Kalen nodded. Why didn't you issue an alert to the control center? Because there wasn't time, Kalen replied. An external intervention introduces noise. Delay creates risk. The fastest solution was here. The student processed that, mandibles twitching. Another spoke, their voice filtered through a trilling vibrato. You moved toward it. Not away. Distance is not always safety, Kalen answered. For predators, retreat signals weakness. Movement must be strategic. When you engage, you define the parameters. If I had run, I would have invited pursuit. I gave it a different puzzle, something it couldn't solve immediately. That hesitation gave me control. That word, control, stuck with them. It wasn't a boast. It was a discipline. Control over body. Over environment. Over perception. This wasn't something that could be downloaded or simulated. It had to be trained, layered into the nervous system, forged under pressure. No amount of theory could replicate it. A third voice joined, this time from a student whose species had never known conflict beyond ritual disputes. How do you regulate fear? Kalen tilted his head, considering the question carefully. You don't remove fear. You compartmentalize it. Humans fear all the time. We just learn to operate through it. We identify what matters now, and file the rest away. You don't overcome fear by erasing it. You move beside it. Let it inform, not paralyze. The insight landed heavier than anything so far. It reframed everything. The others had always believed humans were fearless due to their environment, that Deathworlders were desensitized by exposure. But now they saw it differently. Humans weren't fearless. They were familiar with fear, and had built strategies to endure its constant presence. The room began to shift subtly. Not in movement, but in mindset. Kalen had become more than an instructor. He was now a data point none of them could ignore. A real-time demonstration of theory made manifest. They'd witnessed how a human navigated uncertainty, not with arrogance, not with firepower, but with precision. They would leave this session with more than curriculum. They would leave with a recalibrated understanding of what true threat management looked like. Not overwhelming power. Measured response. The discipline to hold position when everything told you to run. And none of them would ever see humans the same way again. The room gradually returned to equilibrium, but the energy had shifted permanently. Where curiosity once colored the students' perception of their human instructor, now there was an undercurrent of respect threaded with something else, wariness. Not out of fear of aggression, but from witnessing a capability they hadn't known how to recognize before. A skill set invisible in calm, only revealed under stress. Kalen resumed the lesson without flourish. No dramatics, no commentary on what had just occurred. He picked up where the curriculum left off, returning to the technical mechanics of biosphere modulation and behavioral thresholds in predatory species. But now, every word carried amplified weight. Not because his tone had changed, it hadn't, but because the students now heard him through the filter of proven credibility. He introduced the next topic with a practical example, drawing from the predator's brief escape. Observe its response curve during exposure to foreign stimuli. It wasn't just the environment it reacted to, but the change in expected outcomes. Instinct falters when inputs defy prediction. Several students took notes with renewed urgency. For them, this was no longer abstract theory. It was validated field data. They had seen how real-time decisions altered outcomes faster than protocol could adapt. One crystalline student began recording the environmental fluctuation log, cross-referencing it with the predator's movement timestamps. Another began drafting a behavioral map overlay. Kalen let them work, monitoring with quiet approval. The class no longer treated the human as a statistical outlier. He had become a living reference point. They weren't merely studying interspecies dynamics anymore. They were revising their own assumptions about what competence looked like across species lines. Several had grown up hearing that humans were reckless, impulsive, difficult to classify. But what they had seen today wasn't disorder. It was focus under pressure, honed and deliberate. One student finally voiced the collective thought lingering beneath the surface. "Why do you teach when you could command?" Kalen looked up briefly, then back at the interface panel. "Because command without comprehension is fragile. Authority means little if those under it don't understand why decisions are made. Teaching creates resilience. I'd rather build minds that can respond than followers who wait for orders." The response quieted the room again. Not because it was dramatic, but because it suggested something deeper about humanity, not just what they survived, but why they shared what they learned. Kalen's strength wasn't just in his reflexes or logic. It was in his clarity of purpose. He wasn't there to dominate. He was there to transfer a framework for surviving what couldn't be predicted. After some time, he ended the session. Assignment is the same. Behavior modeling of non-sapient species. But now include a variable you can't control. Your task isn't to eliminate uncertainty. It's to adapt within it. The class remained seated longer than usual. Not from confusion, but reflection. Some students looked at each other, recalibrating social hierarchies internally. A few glanced back toward the containment ring, where the predator now lay dormant, visibly subdued. What once seemed like a threat beyond measure now looked different, still dangerous, but understandable in context. As the room slowly emptied, small discussions began in hushed tones. A few students stayed behind, forming an impromptu group around the data terminals. They weren't required to remain, but something compelled them to study deeper. Theories were being re-examined. Protocols rewritten. Every equation they'd used to model predator behavior had just encountered a real-world exception. And it came in the form of someone who had done nothing but stay calm and act precisely. Kalen logged the class attendance without comment. To him, the lesson was routine. But for the students, it marked a quiet turning point. They had come to learn about containment and biological interaction. They had ended up witnessing the practical boundary between theory and survival. There were no medals. No announcements. No ceremonial recognition of what had occurred. But the next time they studied humans in galactic defense databases, they would read those dry reports differently. They would understand that the warnings weren't exaggerated. And more importantly, they would finally comprehend why humanity didn't posture or brag. They didn't need to. They just responded.